Hello, everybody. Hi, welcome. My name is Sarah Backley, and I'm Associate Director at the British Chamber of Commerce here in Japan. On behalf of the BCCJ, I'd like to thank you all so much for joining today's session, which we are holding in collaboration with the Financial Times Board Directors Programme, with thanks to Chris Moon and Vinci Chung, who are on the call today, for many back and forth emails over the past few months and for all the arrangements that have been made on their side. At the BCCJ, we kickstarted a new series last month in June entitled Future of Work, Building Back Better. In this, we focus on post-COVID recovery, reviewing trends and exploring all possibilities for what the post-pandemic workplace should look like. And our first event focused on the well-being and the mental health of employers and employees. A full write-up is available on the BCCJ website in case this is of interest to you. We're also really keen to hear any ideas that you have for future topics that you think would be relevant to you for us to cover in this series. So please do let us know, let the BCCJ team know. As you will have seen from the title when signing up to today's event, we'll be looking at the ways in which a board's job is likely to change as we emerge from the pandemic. Companies have had to adapt and very quickly get used to operating remotely. Of course, this is something that boards have been required to do also. And as many of you, I think, on the call will know perhaps firsthand, this only heightened the expectations of boards and its members to provide expertise and strategic oversight during a time which many may not have had a disaster recovery plan in place. So today we'll be looking at some of the major challenges and changes that boards have faced these past 19, 20 months now, and how these have been dealt with, and also some current trends in the operations and the compositions of boards, which could be signs of what's to come in the future. Our three speakers today, who our moderator will introduce shortly, they're all coming from three very different backgrounds when it comes to their knowledge and their involvement in corporate boards. And from a short pre-event discussion, I can see we have some real variety in thoughts and experiences on the topic. So you're in for an insightful treat session, and I encourage you to please send in any questions you have using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens throughout the session, and our panelists will do their best to get to as many as they can during the hour. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Diana Wu-David, who I think many of you may know, a former Financial Times executive, founder of the Financial Times Non-Executive Director's Diploma in Asia. I think I've got that right. She's also the founder of Future Proof Lab and is a future of work consultant and coach. The most ideal person, I think, to be moderating today's session. So I'd like to pass over to you, Diana, to introduce our panelists and today's session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Yes, it's not that often I get to combine my two loves in future of work and board governance. So this is really exciting. And each of our panelists are extraordinary in their own right, but kudos to you and Financial Times for bringing them together. And I'd love to just introduce them briefly. I know that they have long and illustrious bios, but we have Suzanne Thorning-Lund, who's a partner in board practice for Odgers Berndtson. And she has been really focused on board evolution and succession planning for chairs and outside board directors, and has worked in multiple jurisdictions. She comes to us from the UK right now, but has also done a lot of work in Japan and also sits on the Diversity Steering Council. Anna Dingley, who is founder of Japan Connect and a non-executive director at Nihon M&A Center, also has a career spanning over 25 years in Japan in finance, technology, and government. And not only has her current board position, which she joined during COVID, has also been on the board of Japan Society, and in her new role has been really focused on the future of helping things like artificial intelligence startup spark cognition, et cetera. And then, of course, Leo Lewis, who is the Asia business editor for Financial Times. And he has spent many years in Asia, previously the Tokyo correspondent for Financial Times before overseeing all of coverage in Asia, and prior to that in Beijing. And he has I've been reading his governance stories. He won an award for his coverage of the downfall of Carlos Ghosn. And of course, we've been looking at a lot of different board governance stories. So I'm really excited to have all of these folks here in one room and look forward to our conversation. Welcome. So let's get started. I think just to set things up, I would like, Leo, I'm wondering what we're seeing now on boards that could be signs of what's to come. You've talked a lot about things like pressure from shareholders and GBIF mandates. Can you give us a sense of what you see as being clues to the future that people on boards need to be thinking about? You're on mute, Leo.
I mean, you're absolutely right that this period, whether by coincidence or not, this period between 2020 and 2021 has been one of really substantial change in Japan. And it's, in my view, it was something that was building anyway. And what I suspect and what we're, I think, seeing certainly in our exchanges with companies and with board members, is that in the first few years after the governance code came into force in 2015, the focus for us and for the companies was, how compliant are we with the governance code? Are we, do we look compliant? Are we really compliant? And then there's the questions of what sort of enforcement the governance code would have. And I think what's happened, and this has been much more sort of subtle and not necessarily as broadly covered, has been the power that the stewardship code, which actually came around at the same time, has had. The stewardship code has ended up putting a great deal more pressure on shareholders to hold companies and boards to account. And I think that that what we once saw was a large chunk of listed Japanese companies with a very high proportion of foreign shareholders, 30% in many cases of a lot of the biggest Japanese names. And there was always this assumption, that 30% would translate into sort of ongoing pressure on those companies, on those boards. And oddly enough, it never quite had that effect, or it may have done so at the margins, but never quite had that effect. And it was never quite clear why. And in fact, a couple of analysts had done analysis suggesting that actually, those foreign shareholders were more likely to vote in line with management in many cases than their Japanese counterparts. CLSA did some analysis on that. And that's what's changed, is that the stewardship burdens, and burdens is perhaps too negative a word, but the pressures, the stewardship pressures are pushing everyone towards applying greater pressure to these boards. And just, in answer to the original question, which is how are we seeing this, it's one of the things that is very visible to us has been the extent to which the IR departments of these big listed companies are now playing a much greater role of conveying what the shareholders are saying back to the management, back to the boards and back to the management before it becomes the kind of issue that can blow up and become an embarrassment. So, we saw spectacularly in Toshiba's case, shareholders calling for an extraordinary general meeting of shareholders, and that had always been the kind of nuclear option in cases companies just saw that as so awful that they'd do anything to avoid it. And now that river's been crossed, and so now you have that out there. We're seeing IR departments much more under pressure to make sure that they're telling the boards, hang on, have we got a problem here? We know about what's been identified as a problem and how much do we understand before we go into our board meeting. So that's the signal I would say that's been the clearest.
So it sounds like the IR departments are certainly stepping up, but Suzanne, you have been recruiting board directors, and I remember a couple of years ago in Japan, there was a sea change. There were sort of foreigners coming on as non-executive directors. What do you see? Boards are made up of people. What do you see as the future? How is composition, changing, and what's going to happen on boards because of it, do you think?
Yeah, no, and thank you for that. And I think probably just worth saying that probably I will draw on breadth rather than specifically Japan per se. But if you sort of look at boards around the globe that we advise, I think there are probably three key elements that boards are really focusing on now, much more notably in the last 18, 20 months. The first being people. So proactively talent management. That's in part borne out by chief execs just being tired. I mean, literally just tired. Executive teams have worked solidly. Most companies have seen an extraordinary pulling together of people to try to combat what has been an unprecedented crisis in many cases. But, boards have had to observe chief executives remotely online and trying to work out whether, are they still coping? And, that's quite a difficult thing, and that makes boards quite anxious. So therefore, it means a proactive talent management now is much more prevalent. So we're seeing boards now engaging in very significant CEO succession mapping exercises. This is not when they go out and seek a new CEO, but they want to find out if the CEO falls onto the proverbial bus, as we say in England, who else are in the market would be able for them to take over potentially. And that is not just the CEO, but it's the exco, and actually it's the next level down. So much more emphasis on that. Second, in part instigated by the very sad effects of George Floyd in the US, but diversity, generally speaking, on boards is something which is, again, much more prevalent, and that is not just in the US and the UK or Europe generally, but around the world. People are much more open, much more inclusive in that regard, thinking that everybody who comes from the same education, same backgrounds, etc., although you might be more comfortable with them, will ask the same questions that you would ask. And therefore, actually, it's important to have that diversity. So that's, I think, is the second point. And the third point, not surprisingly, is ESG more broadly. So environmental, societal, sustainability, climate change, etc., again, has rocketed up the agenda. Things like, for example, climate change was very much in vogue 2006-07. Then we had the financial crisis. Boards completely and utterly shut down and focused on survival, understandably so, financial survival. But now, actually, following this particular crisis, climate-related conversations are not being shut down. They have to be escalated. So those would be the three big areas.
And feel free to jump in, all of my panelists, but also to you in the audience. I will monitor the Q&A chat, which is at the bottom right hand of your Zoom screen. I would love to know, Anna, we've talked about boards and stewardship, and I totally agree, Suzanne. I remember that was a hot topic a couple of years ago for Asia Corporate Governance Summit in Malaysia. And it's something, even with the business roundtable, I would say, talking about stakeholder management is even a bit like that, not code, specifically in a code. But Anna, one of the things that we haven't talked about is the whole cybersecurity. I just wrote an article for another publication on digital transformation, both within the board, but also the reaction to the cybersecurity threats and remote work. I mean, you have been delving into that on both levels, both within the board and outside. What do you see? Are boards ready for that?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and really should just say thanks again for inviting me to join the board. It's really interesting to hear everybody's contributions and obviously the audience too. I think my overriding point, sort of thoughts, I should say, it's difficult to generalize. There's good companies in some countries. There's some that are sort of maybe not operating to an optimal level. I think that you know, and the company's culture has such a big influence, and the board's culture, on whether they are addressing all these needs, whether it's cybersecurity or digitalization or the people side, or that sort of future succession planning. You know, there's the culture side, and then there's the regulation. And I think Nihon M&A Center, where I work, where I'm first foreign non-executive director to join the board, the company has got a very solid, positive corporate culture, where actually integrally the CEO and the strong team, both the executives as well as the sort of the management teams, have been always looking to ensure that they've got a resilient company, that they're making a profit without compromising the people and the planet. They're you know, they always looking 10, 15 years ahead to try and work out how they can cope. And I think a lot of we're in quite an interesting position, because a lot of Nihon M&A Center's clients are these smaller sort of SMEs in Japan that maybe don't have that that are looking for a successor, may not have that succession plan in place yet. So as part of our integral business, we're always dealing with thousands of companies who are grappling with these future work issues, and whether they've got the people in place or the digital sort of support structures in place. We're sort of at the heart of advising a lot of companies in that, so we have to then bring it into ourselves. I think just to answer your specific points about the sort of cyber security and the technology side, I mean, I was working with an artificial intelligence company in the US that was selling a lot of artificial artificial intelligence aided cyber security. It's always going to be changing. You know, you've got to really be on the front foot with that and make sure that you can pick up threats that haven't necessarily been out there. They haven't got the signals there before. So it is a challenge, and I would hesitate for any company to say that they're always ready, because I think you've got to be. It's constantly changing, and if you've got the attitude in place to constantly be reviewing that, then I think that I feel comfortable that Nihon M&A Center is managing that correctly, certainly.
And one of the things that I thought was so funny in our original call was you saying, you know, it's one thing for a board, and I'm sure, Suzanne, you see so much demand for digitally savvy board directors, because part of stewardship of a board and a company really is thinking about what is next. But Anna, you told me about going onto the board, and the idea of you going onto the board where you were the only person dialing in, or what you said you were saying you were trying to figure out what everybody was saying and their expressions, but they were all wearing masks. Tell me what that was like.
Well, yeah, we were talking, weren't we, of the actual practical difficulties. I do believe there's the theory, like in everything in life, there's the theory and then there's the practical. And I think we were having a discussion, weren't we, I think, about how, I think Suzanne mentioned how that some companies, some boards have tried to say, well, if one person is remote, everybody should be remote. Or if one, and in my position, we couldn't do that really, because I wouldn't want everybody to be remote in Japan just because I can't be there in person. And so we were talking, weren't we, about the challenges, I suppose, of having that diversity that we all now recognize is important, but that's diversity in location, and then how you can do that. But yeah, so my reality of joining a board, whereas I'd always envisaged, and I think probably most of us had, it would be in a big boardroom and you can meet people and maybe go for drinks or dinner or lunch, and you know, like with our normal interactions in our social lives as well as business lives, that's a very different type of vibe and feel from just having a Zoom call like this. But the reality for me has been that, yeah, the taking part in a board meeting has been at 1 o'clock in the morning with everybody wearing a mask. Now, if I haven't met them, because they're in the same room, so I haven't met them yet, and I don't really know their voices over Zoom at 1 o'clock in the morning in Japanese, it's been a challenge, but one that, you know, I feel very honoured to have, and I do, to your point, to Leo's point really about the institutional investors and the foreign institutional investors at Neon M&A Centre. Over 50% of the investors now are foreign, and actually, but that has been a virtuous circle from the IR teams as well that Suzanne mentioned, and constantly feeding back, having good relationships with the investors, so long-term good relationships that you can quickly arrange meetings and have that communication channel in place, and then the board really caring what they think, because it does impact a lot of the business. And then what was the other point we were saying earlier? I think there was something else.
I'm not sure. Suzanne, did you want to jump in?
Go for it.
Yes, I thought I will. I mean, because Anna, we did have a really quite engaged conversation on this topic, and I think it is interesting and relevant for people probably to hear about this. So one of the things I mentioned is, in my observation, there's some of the very big global boards are just used to operating in a virtual world. So some people are in meeting rooms and others are online, etc. So some of the very large boards have done this for many years and are very comfortable operating that environment. I have to say it is incredibly tasking on the behalf of the chairman to orchestrate this and make sure that everybody has an equal say. It's really quite hard and a bit of a skill. But interestingly, I think probably one of the things I have said, we as Headhunter have thought, brilliant, this is very efficient. That means we're now going to see boards going, oh yes, I would like to have a director from Brazil join my board, or someone from Russia, or someone from the east coast of the US. I mean, despite the fact they have to be up at 3 o'clock in the morning or whatever, but if they're willing, why not? Because we'll have that diversity. So we were very excited about this to start with, but this has not transitioned into reality, which is the interesting bit. So most boards, not everybody, and as you said yourself as well, but most boards and conversation I have is that they say, yes, we absolutely would like to have diversity and people from different geographies. We will still have half of our board meetings probably in person, and we want everybody to be there in person, because actually that in-person connectivity is really important. You can have very different conversations if you know them as individuals. You can disagree with people much more comfortably if you know who they are. It's very difficult to do that on Zoom if you don't know people. And then the other sort of half of the meetings could be remote. But the point I was making is that boards, by and large, say, well, everybody has to be together or everybody has to be remote, which is quite interesting.
Well, it's interesting. I was going to ask you about the composition, and we have James actually on the questions, who also said that, you talked about a different composition geographically, but are you seeing in Japan or elsewhere, or Anna and Leo, that the diversity has come to the Japanese board, cultural, racial, ethnic? I mean, is that a driver, for globally? And is it a driver just in the headlines or is it in reality? Any of you who'd like to answer that, feel free.
Well, I'll let Anna speak after. I think one observation is that, I'm always a little bit suspicious when this matter comes up and we're talking, as we might be to to somebody in the C-suite of a company, or whatever level it is we're talking, and they always that they'll answer if it's obvious that they haven't really embraced that significantly. They'll talk about how shallow the pool is of available people, and it's always rather suspicious. We're always rather suspicious of that line, and not just because it's untrue, but because I think it ends up revealing more about the company's willingness to accept that as an answer. And so what you always feel is that you're hearing, oh well, in X company, the dogma is the reason we haven't diversified is because we can't find the right people, or we'd be looking at. I'm sure Suzanne will agree that that's just not an excuse for companies anyway, not just Japan. But so it did make me think, particularly when we talk about the cyber threats and other issues, is that one of the things that has been quite noticeable really over the last sort of 4 or 5 years in Japan is that the governance code, if it's had many effects, but one of the clearest effects has been to create a kind of vocabulary for for understanding what happens when, or why things have gone wrong at certain companies. And what's been interesting has been that when scandal or crisis hits a company in Japan, and over the last few years, it's become much more common to describe it as a governance problem, and then to shift focus of the problem on the board, whereas previously you would say, oh well, it must have been this engineering department that was responsible for this problem, or it must have been this accountant that was responsible for the problem. Whereas now I think that the big difference is that it's much easier to translate it all into there's something at the board level that was deficient, and if that persists and becomes the standard, I think it ends up making big demands on the board in terms of their, right? Because if you know that the next cyber attack on your company is going to be blamed on the board rather than on the IT department, then you have to populate your board with people that know what they're doing when there's a crisis of that nature, or at least are across it. Or, if your problem is quality control lapses, you have to have people on the board that understand the fundamental issues. And so, I mean, again, this is sort of,
It seems dangerous. It seems a little bit dangerous to anticipate that. And a lot of the questions that we're getting through, Leo, you put it in beautifully, in that for years, actually, probably for the better, the requirements have changed for board directors. Their expectations are much higher. And that's been fantastic in many ways. And it's sometimes been driven by regulatory, but a lot of our questions are things like the role of the board was to get into crisis. Is it going to be, are they going to be involved in that? And also, do the boards need to make decisions at this pace, which is, I think, related to crisis communications, or are they going to step back and say, here's the the broad vision, here's the future of the company. I'm going to be a long-term steward. I mean, Anna, what's your sense on your board right now?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think there's a balance between, you have to look at the here and now, and you have to, traditionally, I think it was looking much more further ahead, but now people are, especially during a crisis period, having to address the more pressing issues. I think there's so many interesting points that have come up that I wanted to talk about, but it reminded me, there was a Kinsey report came out a couple of weeks ago saying that as a result of COVID, directors have been spending more time on board work. Like, there is more time, there's more collaboration that's having to happen now between management and directors. There are new processes in place. And I think we all talked before, what I find quite interesting is when they perhaps used to think about non-exec meeting board members, it would be, oh, well, that's just, you only meet 12 times a year or 10 times a year. That's not a very big job. But for this one, at least for me, it's certainly, it's not, we meet, sometimes twice a month. Then there's a lot of meetings in between with individuals. Again, it's because I'm wanting to get to know the different teams. But it's actually a large amount of time, and I think that was reflected in some of the other comments I'm seeing, that people are now having to spend more time on board work. And I think, to the point earlier about diversity and are the people there, are they not there? I think so maybe I think it might have been something like the 30% trouble, people like that saying, well, or actually more broadly, you can actually find non-executive directors or board directors who can be diverse, but if you're not careful, that then turns into a box ticking exercise, and the focus is to make sure that within the management you've got these up and coming, in Japan's case it is up and coming women that you want, and business able sort of experience, or who are willing, who want to join mid-career. But the issue there does come back to, get the practicals of, well, where is the nursery? Are the nurseries? Can you take kids? I mean, I've got a little 2.5-year-old boy, and I've got a lot of friends now with kids that age, and people trying to work out how to get back into work. And in the UK, we do have a lot of different childcare options, whether they're near your house or are they near your office, or does your office provide one, or people aren't really going into the office anymore. And I think, you know, there are some fundamental issues that Japan faces that's not, you know, it's not just on the company, it's a much broader issue, that there just isn't the variety of care options that, you know, once your child is wanting to interact with more kids or go to a little play school. So I think there are challenges sort of more broadly there. And one, you know, there's a couple more points on diversity in Japan. You know, the large companies may have interpreters, but the big elephant in the room is the language. Like, everybody's saying, great, let's get more people on board who can join a Japanese board. Well, can they speak Japanese? I mean, I started learning Japanese in the 90s and I'm still learning a lot. But I can manage in a board, but I do make sure that each board meeting, we have a Jizen Setsumekai. So I have a meeting with the board company secretary who can run through things in advance. If there's something that I haven't caught up properly, I can have a separate meeting as well to find out. There's obviously, I'll get the materials all in Japanese before, but how many Japanese companies really want to have that burden of doing everything in English and having an interpreter, which delays the whole process anyway, and really help people take part and sort of participate in the meeting. So they've got if they're wanting international people, they've got a very small members of group cohort that they could choose from. But there is a cohort of Japanese speaking foreign people, and they do join international boards. You know, you are Japanese boards, you are seeing that. But it is a challenge for Japanese companies to find more, I think. Like
absolutely. Yeah, and you see Chinese boards, you know, suffering. I'm sure, Suzanne, you've seen that. And it's really the ones that are already thinking about going global or operating globally that are starting to do that more, because there's a premium for them to have board directors that are connected in those places and know Spanish or English or whatever else.
There was one other point I wanted to say, quite interesting culturally, when Suzanne was saying perhaps it's easier to disagree in person once you've known them. But I found sometimes, maybe this is a particular Japanese cultural thing, but I find it's maybe easier to disagree remotely, it's not really disagree, but enter a discussion. In Japan, I think, and if I was there as the newbie on the board and you generally do feel a lot of, I would imagine, you know, not because I haven't been there in person, but there's pressure to conform. You're listening a lot more, whereas actually being remote has given me a bit more freedom, I think, to, you know, I'm not bound by the body language signals I'm picking up, but I am bound by our CEO wanting everybody on the board to participate. You know, he says, you're not there just to be there. Everybody has to say something. So I do want to obviously contribute on behalf of the shareholders from what I'm hearing. And so the fact that I'm remote, I think, helps me able to say, right, can I just say my point? And even it's in bad Japanese, but at least I can get it across.
So go ahead, Suzanne.
Sorry, thank you. Again, I mean, it just reflects on some of the conversations we had earlier as well around non-Japanese members of boards in Japan, or indeed, you know, any non-native language speaking director in any other board for that matter. And the challenge, if you have two communication channels with an interpreter in the middle, and as you say, it can be quite clunky. And it just makes for more of a Q&A rather than a fluid conversation where you have a point to make and, you know, the conversation's got on 5 points later. You know, it's quite tricky to have a fluid conversation on that. So I think that's one element. And the other element I think I probably might have mentioned is that in my experience, again, it's a cultural thing. But in most places, you will have board directors, non-executive directors being connected to each other on WhatsApp or other forms, and they will speak to each other between board meetings, not because they want to undermine the CEO or anybody else, but because there might be a point in which they go, oh, I wonder, this is what I've seen in one of my other boards, what have you experienced? And have that informal, appropriate, but nevertheless sort of an informal way of sharing information and knowledge. And I think that is something that board directors, again, has really escalated during this particular crisis where, you know, you've been focusing on trying to solve a particular area or an issue, but actually some of the other finer points, nuance points, you're not able to discuss, which you would do, over a cup of coffee or a cup of tea or breakfast or whatever you would otherwise do. So having that informal channel has been quite important.
Absolutely.
So transitioning out of that, I mean, we've so many of the questions are, and so many of the things that it sounds like all of you have been seeing is really the boards are dealing with COVID, and there are some. I think one of our questions was, how do boards make decisions at pace? Suzanne, that kind of informal WhatsApp, the technology-enabled connection, I think helps them do it. And I look after, I don't know if there is after COVID, but I look at, once we get out of the acute crisis and boards start looking towards the future, I do really wonder how we will transition. How will boards transition once they have to start putting their heads up from the crisis at hand and thinking about longer term issues? So Leo, maybe you can chime in with some of your.
So COVID is an interesting one because it's everyone's problem for now, and so it's been quite difficult to criticize an individual board for its response to COVID, given that every single board has had its own problems and can be identified to shareholders as having done its best in a crisis that nobody quite understood and that was fast moving at the beginning and then became unclear and then more clear, and so on. And I think, if you compare that, for example, with a segment of an industry, for example, semiconductors, which has got, at the moment, where boards have got to deal with an industry specific issue that is more than just, not to minimize it, but more than just to do with the health of your staff and the ability to continue business during a pandemic. But then there's this sort of other, and I think that what's going to happen is that the emergence from COVID is where the great kind of sorting is going to be. So at the moment, boards have actually been given, it's maybe exaggerating to say it's a free pass, but at the moment they haven't been held to individual account for their COVID responses because it's a mass response. But they will, I think, be held to that increasingly as companies are differentiated by how they respond after that. And looking at, just to focus for now on Japanese companies, but I mean, it's going to be true. It's going to be true everywhere. But it's already quite clear that there are going to be companies that do emerge from this with an acknowledgement that they do need to be better ready for the next crisis, and that you can already detect that. There are already companies that are talking in much more, in much more proactive terms than I would necessarily have guessed. I think a lot of the shareholders would guess, and sort of rather encouraging. There's going to be a very big kind of sort of curve of companies that fall short at the point of exit.
Yep. Do any of you have specific initiatives? I mean, I know I was speaking to the head of international for Marriott, and he's very much thinking about, okay, contain, but whoever emerges most quickly out of this crisis is going to win. He's already pushing his people and talking to his board about very much about that kind of acceleration out of pandemic. Are there other specific initiatives that you hear of, Suzanne or Anna or Leo?
Well, I mean, to Leo's point, I think it's right. I mean, companies now, there will be winners and there'll be those who accelerate really fast, and I think that will be the challenge. Do you have the time to accelerate? Do you have the time to actually implement the strategy that you're now looking to implement? Because there's an awful lot of money out there from private equity and activist investors who are looking for businesses that are not fast enough. So,
and to your point, people are tired. Do you have the time and the energy?
Well, that's actually
absolutely. Sorry.
No, to your point earlier, that actually are the CEOs too tired, or what's happening? This has led to acceleration for our business. I don't know if any of you would have seen our previous results for the last quarter, but we did find exactly this, that in the pandemic, a lot of the SME clients that we deal with, they've had a challenging time, potentially, personally, we were talking earlier, so worried about the crisis. They may have had people who had COVID, or they were concerned because they were at the age that would have been ill. And I think they've just, a lot of them have felt, I can't do this anymore, don't want to do this anymore. Let's bring the succession plan forward. They were thinking, I'm going to do this for another 5 to 10 years, this is my life. And then they've had this big challenging event, a global pandemic in their faces, and actually I don't want to do this anymore. So it's led to a big acceleration in our business, because we're dealing with these companies, trying to help them deal with their succession plans. But I think there's a lot of lessons that the people are looking at for a variety of different places to learn lessons about how they could accelerate out of this quickly, and in a ESG compliant sort of embracing way, which I think is, I think, certainly from on Nihon M&A Centre's point of view, is what we're looking forward as our next focus, really, to ensure that all of the practices embrace that. And we joined the FTSE Blossom Index about a month ago, so as a result of these ESG practices. But I think one of the points, I think it was one of the questions as well, somebody's saying, can we learn from the UK? But I think that in Japan and in the UK, as Susan would say, people look to learn from all different jurisdictions and areas. There's the there's various corporate governance associations, aren't there, and academic papers out there comparing different countries on their governance and stewardship. To Leo's point earlier about the stewardship, I think all of the asset managers are hiring, as much as they can, ESG experts, or at least somebody who's got the capacity to purely focus on the ESG side, because I think most of the portfolio managers have had some element of that anyway, that as they're stock picking, but they're now having to get more to ensure that they're following ESG practices. And then there's direct investor feedback. And I've always said, I used to work in investor relations with Japanese companies and international investors, and I'd always say to the companies, the conversation it's not just a one-way street, for the investor asking the company. I say to the company, ask the investor what they think, which companies are they also talking to that do this well, or what do they think you should be doing, or how do they do it, by the way, because some of them might be talking about split of chairman, CEO, for example, but then they don't do the same within their company. So but get as much information as you can from the investors who are actually analyzing a whole range of companies in a really interesting and relevant way that then we can take best practices from.
And
so it's so interesting, this line that we've been hearing. It's for years and years and years, you would meet Japanese CEOs, and they would talk in terms of stakeholders at a time where the rest of the world was really talking, or the rest of the world, let's say that sort of the US, UK approach to shareholder capitalism was talking really about shareholder value and focusing very, very clearly on that. And Japanese were always talking about stakeholders, and you would sometimes in a sort of exasperating way, because it would in their eyes that talking about stakeholders would kind of absolve them from the need to focus as much on shareholders as the shareholders themselves were demanding. And they'd say no, because our customers are a stakeholder, and so are our staff, and so on. And the problem is that with that is that not only was it being used as an excuse not to focus on shareholder value, if they regard that as the most important thing, but it was also, in fact, not even true, because in many cases they weren't that focused on their staff, and certainly not the well-being of their staff in the way that we would probably now think of it, customers certainly would be at the top of this. But anyway, I think my point is that that now that Japanese companies perceive that certainly the rest of the world might be catching up to the idea that stakeholders do have that one should think in terms of sort of diverse group of stakeholders in terms of the company's purpose. And I think there was a question that related to this came in at the company's purpose. That Japan on one side of this, it's saying, well, look, we've been saying this all along. But on the other, it now has to be held to whether it actually ever believed that wholeheartedly, and whether whether it can walk the walk really on something it has been saying pretty consistently for 20 years, 20, 30 years, really, in my experience of do we really believe that these stakeholders do have this value? And if so, okay, so we'll show it. And the board, a board which is which is under pressure to show that focus, that equal weighted focus on stakeholders, does have a lot of work to do. But having said it for so long, the pressure is actually even greater on Japanese boards to do that. Yeah.
It's the old adage, isn't it? Look at what they do, not what they say. I suppose always look at
Well, I mean, Anna, the other thing is that that one of the things that you brought up with the issue with translations and so on. It's actually, we're at a funny moment in which some companies do need to have another think about why they're listed at all. And I think historically that there were a lot of American companies in the sort of 10 years ago, in that sort of time frame, 10, 15 years ago, that started having that discussion and ended up deciding actually, we may not need to be listed, or we may sell ourselves to private equity and so on. Yeah. But I think in Japanese, that debate in Japan, we're still in the very early stages of that debate, in my experience, that companies are talking about it for the first time as a kind of tentative, well, we can see the downside of being listed now. So I think in the past it was completely taboo to sort of even entertain the idea that you needed the kind of the prestige of being listed. And I'm sure you get a little bit of that, not with some of the small companies that are clients of Nihon M&A, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's different motivations as well in the US, isn't it? I mean, there's no doubt that the private equity world is sort of growing, and people actually, maybe not just for necessarily all the good reasons we might think about that, they just don't want to be listed anymore because they don't want to be beholden to the shareholders, or they want to be able to make their own decisions, and they can raise enough capital in other ways to actually get on with what they wanted to do. So yeah, you're right, they don't have the same motivations. I think in Japan, the other interesting element that's sort of a bit behind is that is giving the staff options, and giving staff options in the company, share options in the company, I mean, and that's been a big factor that has boosted a lot of sort of longer term employees staying at a company in the US, and hasn't really been an impact in Japan as much, but I think it's you're starting to see that more and more in Japan now, which then does tie it more to the listed side. I think there is definitely that element of kudos, right from when we were trying to launch the AIM market in Tokyo, and it's now thriving as Tokyo Pro Market, which Nihon M&A Center is working on. But there's a cost to listing for a lot of the SMEs, and then Tokyo AIM didn't have to have all the documents in both languages, actually, which was quite a different another element sort of in terms of actually just the translations, but the time around it and the people involved. So I think people are recognizing that it's expensive, but there is around trying to recruit more staff and company awareness. There's so many other sort of soft benefits for being listed that I think people are still acutely aware of in Japan, which is why they still have that as a goal, even if they're quite small.
It seems like it's become more expensive to be listed, period, even for large companies on global stock exchanges because of the risk. But Suzanne, what were you going to say? Do people want to be in a listed company? I'm sort of curious.
No, I mean, it's a very good point. And it's very interesting. We were talking about the huge pressures that are on board directors now, governance, stewardship. A lot of box ticking is the word I hear all the time. So there are many board members now who are frustrated, many chief executives who are frustrated because they have these fabulous people sitting around the board whom they'd like to engage with to help develop strategy, to think about the future, to draw on their experience and their connections. And I spend most of the time going, well, have we supplied or complied with section 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 in the governance code, and how do we meet that, and what do we say in our annual report, etc. So there is a huge amount of governance that a lot of directors are just not engaging with. I mean, and chief exec not engaging with. So I think that is one aspect of it. The other aspect we're finding now is because of that, and because of the global pandemic, board directors are more reluctant to sit on several boards. So historically, I mean, there are rules and regulations around how many boards is enough really in European market. But say historically, people who might have served on 4 boards. Now people go, maybe 3 is enough actually, because I do need to have the flexibility to really get engaged with boards. And that therefore limits the pool potentially of available talent, certainly with the experienced board director nature within sort of the global board market, if you like. And going back to one of the questions raised, how do we bring on board the new and next cadre of non-exec directors? How do we develop those? Where do we find those? And that goes, and that is what a lot of the conversations we're having now, not just for diversity, but generally is, how do you bring in new directors with different perspectives, different skill sets, just different backgrounds, and integrate them into a boardroom in such a fashion that they will contribute in a collegiate, collaborative fashion? I mean, they will have views, and they, to the point Anna made earlier, do you disagree or not? But learning to disagree. But you don't want the grit in the oyster. I mean, the pearl would be fantastic, but you want something that actually creates that pearl as opposed to something that becomes really irritating. And so now we're working with boards on shadow boards. So, so they have boards that are shadowing, getting more or less the same board papers as the main board. And they'll be consisting of 6 to 7 directors who will be in their 20s and 30s. Some of whom will be drawn from inside the company and some who will be external. And they run them for a year and then they rotate them. But, that's one way of just getting that exposure and just getting a sense in from the outside. What is it that we, the board, don't know? And B, a way of trying to escalate the talent and the development within your own ranks.
I think that's a great way to sort of start to wrap us up as we come to the top of the hour. And we had a question on the future of work and sort of how boards can prepare for, I would say we've talked about more diversity. We've talked about, diversity, racial, ethnic, geographic, which kind of touches on the remote work as well. And so, Suzanne, some of the practices that are happening, and you started us off with the idea of the talent management and the increased focus that boards now really have to put on people as opposed to strategy and, sadly, and compliance and the box ticking. So I think that with that as a sort of context, I'd love to ask you each to answer one last kind of rapid fire question. In the context of the future of work, what's one thing you think boards should focus on going forward?
Nobody's going to say anything.
Okay.
Anna, you spoke first. You're going first.
I mean, the thing is, I was thinking about. It's so difficult because there's not one thing. Yeah. I feel like it's a constantly evolving story and communication, and I think. I was, a classic answer to that. I could have said something about, well, you're making sure that you walk the walk and you talk the talk. So it is having that ESG messaging right at your fingertips and communicating. But actually, if I was going to distill it, I think it comes down to a team. You need to make sure your team of the executives and and the non-execs and the execs are working towards the right goal. And you need in that team people who can make sure that the executives are spending the right amount of time, but not too much time, doing that tick box exercise. You need great corporate secretaries and lawyers like your corporate advisors on board. Yep. But I think that team, you've got to get the team right. Yeah.
Okay, so great. Okay, Anna, you're cut off from rapid fire question answer. Leo, do you have an answer? What do you think boards should be focusing on to emerge stronger in the future?
so it's difficult to answer. One thing I would say, and I don't want to end on too negative a note, but I do think it's interesting that what tends to be a good rule of thumb is that you look at what the Keidanren Business Federation is pushing back against, and then you identify that as probably the best thing that could happen, right? And so, what you tend to find is, and the reason I say that is because specifically the kind of skill matrix model of building boards and having a kind of identifiable skill matrix for boards is something that Keidanren is quietly pushing back against. And that what that indicates to me is, one, it's a great idea, and two, that the Keidanren's membership is saying that's the kind of pressure that's going to make us look bad, in the short and long term. And so therefore, for now, let's try and punt it out into the future. So that's how I would identify things that could be good in terms of what's being pushed back against.
Well, not negative, but potentially provocative. Absolutely provocative. All right. All right, Suzanne, you get the last word. What do you think the board should be focusing on?
Well, I mean, I have to say I'm completely with Leo, if I have to say. I think if you look at it, the board of directors and the churn of board directors is one of your greatest assets. If you think about it, how can you bring in the relevant skill set that would help you as a business and you as a leaders meet whatever crisis there are. So I think being open and transparent about board succession and board rotation. Don't wait for the last week or 2 weeks or last month. Have a plan. Think about it in a continual way throughout the year and be open with your directors about it.
That is fantastic. Thank you, guys. I think that to sort of sum up, I would say that in the past, boards were really focused on stability in order to achieve sustainability. And now they need to focus on agility in order to maintain sustainability or to be sustainable. So that's sort of what I got from your answers and from our conversation as a whole. So thank you so much to my panelists. I will hand it back to BCCJ. It's been a really interesting conversation, and I look forward to carrying it forward in future sessions.
Thanks, Diane.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone so much. Anna, Suzanne, Diana, Leo, for your time today. Lots of fantastic insight, which I think it'll take us all a while to process. But our lovely editor will be writing up a full summary of today's session, which will be up on the BCCJ website shortly. I will share that with everyone on the call once it's up. Thank you everyone for joining, and we hope to see you at a BCCJ event soon. Thanks.